Hello everyone, you welcome to The Insight. I am Babli Jonathan. Today we're going to be analyzing genuine and inclusive dialogue as the solution to the close to 6-year-long armed conflict in the northwest and southwest regions of the Republic of Cameroon, according to South African politician, Apartheid chief negotiator Roelf Meyer. This is the only way out of the Anglophone crisis. He made this known during his recent visit to the Republic of Cameroon. Meet him in some few seconds. Our guest today, Roelf Meyer, is a South African politician and businessman, originally member of the National Party in his country. He is known for his prominent role in the negotiations to end the apartheid system in South Africa. He later co-founded the United Democratic Movement. Roelf Meyer was the National Party government's chief negotiator during the transition from apartheid, and under President Nelson Mandela, he was South Africa's Minister of Constitutional Development and Provincial Affairs from 1994 to 1996. He is a consultant. He's a consultant on conflict resolution, peace processes, and negotiations. Roelf Meyer, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
All right, you were recently in Cameroon and you discussed with a certain number of persons in Yaoundé, in Douala, and the country is celebrating or celebrated National Unity Day on May 20, 2022. That's the 50th anniversary of the country's unification. What do you think about the unity of the Republic of Cameroon today?
Well, I have to say, unfortunately, according to my observation, that the country is struggling at the moment to present that unity to the international community because of the Anglophone crisis that is prevailing in the southwest and the northwest regions. And I think it's very important that ways be found in order to resolve that crisis, to stop the bloodshedding and to stop the violence. It is a great pity to my mind, and I'm speaking as an outsider, that this is going on now for some time, particularly since 2017 and onwards, and I really hope that this can be brought to an end. And let me emphasize, in the South African case, we also had differences between different ethnic communities that had to be resolved. There was a period of big contestation, especially after the release of President Mandela from prison. And that contestation led to violence. But we, in the end, resolved it because of the talks that were taking place, the dialogue that prevailed, but also the fact that we recognize the importance of every individual on an equal basis in our new constitution, the Democratic Constitution of South Africa. And I think that is probably a way to think about how to resolve also the crisis in Cameroon. In other words, recognition of human rights on an individual basis and on an equal basis for all the citizens of Cameroon.
You discussed with some persons when you visited Cameroon recently in Yaoundé and Douala and so on. What's your take about the prevailing situation on the ground?
Yeah, I would say it's very unfortunate that there is ongoing violence. And, you know, like we have learned in the South African case, there's only one way to stop violence, and that is eventually through dialogue, or rather talks that could lead to dialogue and that could lead to negotiations in finding a peaceful settlement. So the message from the South African experience will always be that dialogue is the only way to stop violence.
All right. Now, before we proceed to talk about that in details, to talk about genuine and inclusive dialogue as the only way out of the Anglophone crisis, according to you and many other persons, let's go back a little bit into history to talk about the situation in South Africa during the apartheid period, and you were the chief negotiator from the government. How did you go about, getting the country through the transition from apartheid to what we have today, to present-day South Africa?
Yeah, I want to emphasize, apartheid was a terrible system that oppressed the black majority in South Africa. And it was done under apartheid rule, which was very dictatorial and authoritarian by nature. So the white minority ruled the country, especially during the late 1980s, with very strong measures under a national state of emergency. And fortunately, wisdom prevailed on both sides, from the apartheid ruler's side, but also from the side of the liberation movements, mainly led by the African National Congress. And that so happened that after the release of President Mandela from prison at the beginning of 1990, we could therefore sit at the table, start talking to each other, and that led to dialogue. It took us some 2 years before we actually entered real negotiations. Even after the release of President Mandela, it took us, in other words, another 2 years before we really started negotiations. But I think it was that patience on both sides that helped us to overcome the difficulties that prevailed under apartheid. And I think it can be said that the anti-apartheid struggle by the majority of South Africans was worthwhile, and they succeeded in liberating South Africa from the apartheid rule.
What are some of the obstacles, and how did you move around those obstacles, or how did you overcome those obstacles to take the country through that transition?
Well, there was, of course, a lot of obstacles. Some of it was laid in fear, because the white minority, as you can imagine, was very fearful about what will happen if the black majority would take over and what they would do with the white minority. Another obstacle was the fact that not everybody was agreeable to the idea that there should be negotiations. Some people on the side of the black majority thought that they should only take power and move forward without negotiating a peaceful settlement. So those were part of the obstacles that we had to address. But I think the main point is wisdom prevailed on the side of the leaders on both sides. President Mandela on the side of the black majority and President de Klerk on the side of the white minority. And that wisdom from both sides helped us to start the talks. And I want to emphasize here, a dialogue is not necessarily in the making from day one. One has to accept there have to be even covert talks before you can come to the point of real dialogue. And that is how it started in South Africa. Talks about talks, then real talks, then dialogue, and then eventually negotiations. Experts will tell you that in most cases, and from the expertise that prevail in other circumstances, that is the method and the path that one has to follow if you want a peaceful settlement eventually.
What are some of the good practices and values that can be extracted from the example of South Africa to other African countries suffering, probably not because of apartheid, but because of other conflicts that have erupted and causing a lot of trouble, threatening to break up the countries?
Well, I think, from the South African experience, I would single out 3 factors that were very instrumental in helping us to overcome our problems and that laid the basis for successful negotiations. The first is that we followed a very inclusive process. In other words, all parties that were part of the conflict were invited and respected to come to the table, negotiating table, to sit down and talk and raise their views and contribute to the discussions and the negotiations. So it was a very inclusive process. At all given times during the negotiations, we had more than 20 parties who participated, meaning that it was a very inclusive process. Secondly, the second factor is that we succeeded in building trust between the opposing sides. And you can imagine when we started off with talks in South Africa, we were like enemies against each other, the black majority against the white minority. But we succeeded in building trust through the talks and dialogue and negotiations eventually. We succeeded to build a level of trust that helped us to overcome the problems that existed. So that was a very successful method that we applied in South Africa. And one has to realize that trust is not something that you have necessarily on the first day of talks. It has to come over a period of time. Various confidence-building measures needed to be applied so that people started to believe in each other and to trust each other. But the building of trust was a very successful method in the South African case. And then the third one was that we took ownership of our problems. We took ownership of the conflict. And we took responsibility to resolve it. So it was not left to others from outside. It was not something that we needed even mediators for. It was South Africans themselves who resolved the problems. And that level of trust and the notion of ownership helped us to overcome the problems. So I can say that the fact that our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the chief negotiator on behalf of the ANC, and I myself, as the previous government's chief negotiator, developed a level of trust and ownership that helped us to really resolve the problems in South Africa.
All right. I want us to go to the newsstands and see what the newspapers reported in the Republic of Cameroon this week. And after the press review by Immaculate Fogwe, we're going to see just how some of the things that you've said now can be implemented in Cameroon to put an end to the killings, the destruction, and the sufferings of the people in the northwest and southwest regions of the country. We'll be right back in some few minutes.
The Guardian Post exclaims, health disaster looms in Bamenda as separatists threaten to chase out Hisakam workers. Another edition of the Guardian Post says separatist fighters kidnapped 19 CDC workers in Idinao. Municipal Updates projects the Old Dian Conference by saying it inspired new community outreach approach. It says the scheme is credited to PM John Gute's spirit of peace and development. As reported by the Advocate, South African negotiator gives model to end Anglophone crisis. The Median, March past rehearsals, 20th May fever rocks Yaoundé. Cameroon Insider projects the unitary state at 50 while highlighting final preparations made for the 20th May parade. The Guardian Post, May 20th March past in Yaoundé, government imposes tough conditions on political parties. The Horizon exclaims, 2018 presidential election, Professor Maurice Kamto resumes stolen victory claim. Cameroon Echo says, President Paul Biya returned home after shortest private stay in Europe. Until I come your way again, this is Press Review.
Thank you, Immaculate Fogwe, for the press review, and we're still with our guest, Roelf Meyer, South African politician, expert in peace, negotiation, conflict resolution. Now, before we proceed to talk about genuine and inclusive dialogue as the ultimate solution to the Anglophone crisis, Roelf, you said that while you were in Cameroon, you discussed with some people in Yaoundé and Douala, and there's something that shocked you. What's that thing? Can you tell us about that?
I think the single most important thing that struck me was the level of violence that, according to the sources and the witnesses that I've been talking to that prevail in the southwest and the northwest of the country, in those regions. I must say that, to the outside community, that is not knowledge that generally comes across. And therefore, it was for me news and a shock to that extent, the level of violence that is taking place. And I would just say that I think every effort has to be made to bring this to closure and to bring it to a fruitful solution that can last on an ongoing basis.
All right. Do you think that the international community should do more? Because as of now, we've only had the international community condemning violence, calling for restraint on both parties, and calling for the respect of international and humanitarian laws, and so on. Do you think the international community should do more, should go beyond that?
I would not like to express a view about the position that the international community should take, because I'm not, I don't have all the knowledge in that regard, and so I have to be cautious in saying things that I am not, that I don't have first knowledge about. But let me put it this way. In the South African case, there was a long time pressure from the outside against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And that pressure came across through very comprehensive sanctions against South Africa. I think one can say that the regime of sanctions or punitive measures against the apartheid regime during the 1980s was the most comprehensive set of sanctions ever applied in the world, because it was multilateral and bilateral from all regions of the globe. And that contributed to bringing down the apartheid regime. That contributed to bring about change in South Africa. So it was very effective, at least as far as an international perspective is concerned. But at the same time, I want to emphasize that once the process of change started, in other words, once President Mandela was released from prison and the process of talk started, it was over to us. The international community then didn't further interfere. They allowed us to take the necessary steps to talk to each other, to negotiate a peaceful settlement on our own. And I think that is very important. The most that the international community during that period did was to actually give silent support and give advice where it was necessary to help us to overcome stumbling blocks and inhibitors, and to make a peaceful progress with the process of talks and negotiations. So I think it's important, and this is something that I would always advise in all conflict situations, and that is that local leadership have to take the responsibility. They have to take the ownership to fix the problem and to come to a solution.
All right, now I want us to go back to the drawing board and take a look at two keywords: genuine and inclusive. Genuine and inclusive. First of all, genuine. In the context of Cameroon, what do you put in that word, genuine?
Well, let me not be specific about Cameroon, because again, I don't want to, from my limited knowledge base, think that I can give advice. But let me share with you what we have experienced in South Africa. For a long period, prior to the real negotiations, there were attempts by the apartheid government to talk and negotiate with leaders that were not genuine leaders. And that is why I emphasize the need for genuine and inclusive negotiations. And genuine in that regard means people who are representative of all the communities and all the parties in the country on a legitimate basis. I think that is the context in which one has to see the concept of genuine. Those leaders that have legitimacy and credibility amongst their supporters and represent the people of the country have to be at the table, have to participate in the negotiations. Otherwise, you can't call it genuine negotiations.
All right, now, inclusive. Recently, the government organized the major national dialogue, and many politicians of the opposition and civil society leaders said that dialogue was not genuine. It was not inclusive. You've talked about genuine. It was not inclusive. But the government on its own side is saying it was inclusive because we had representatives on the Social Democratic Front, which is a political party of the opposition, from other civil society leaders, religious bodies, and so on. So let's clear the air on this. Inclusive. When you talk about inclusive, what exactly are you referring to?
Well, in the South African case, it was President Mandela who led us in the example of what inclusivity or inclusive parties, big and small, even to come forward and to participate in the negotiations. And it was not decided from the top who those parties are. It was also not decided who should represent those parties. The parties had the freedom to come to the table because they were invited to come to the table out of their own willingness and intention. There was no prescription, and there was no selected few that were invited to come to the negotiations. It was not decided by the then government or by the majority party, meaning the ANC, who should be at the negotiating table. Parties were allowed to come if they had the will and the intent to come and participate in the negotiations. And it is for that reason that I said earlier that more than 20 parties participated at all given stages in the negotiations. And I think what inclusiveness means is that everybody has a seat at the table. All parties had a seat at the table. If they decided to leave the table, to leave the negotiations, it was their right to do so. But their seat then remained open until they decided to come back and fill that seat again.
All right, now, how should this solution of genuine and inclusive dialogue be implemented in Cameroon to solve the Anglophone problem?
I would say the important thing is, again, from the lesson in South Africa, is that unless there's going to be genuine and inclusive participation, it's hard to think that the solution is going to come forward by itself. So what it means is that parties have to start talking to each other, firstly, in my mind. And that is exactly what we did in South Africa. For 2 years, we were talking to each other without a structured process. We started to develop an understanding of each other. We started to develop respect for each other. And we started to develop also an understanding of what are the issues that had to be addressed. What are the issues that needed to be resolved as far as the conflict is concerned. So that informal process of talks and talks about talks helped us over a period of 2 years to get to a phase where we then could say, okay, let's structure the negotiations. And then on a multi-party basis, in other words, on a basis where the multitude of parties participated, we came together and we structured the process of negotiations also on an inclusive basis. You can't expect one party to prescribe to the other, whether it's the biggest party or the smallest party. None of them should prescribe to the others how the negotiations should take place. It should be a genuine process of inclusive decision-making. So the process in that regard, I would say, is equally important to the content that needs to be addressed and that needs to be resolved. I keep on thinking back in the South African case, for us, process and content were equally important. It was like 50-50. If you don't have a process that is inclusive, that people are prepared to participate in, you don't have participation that is legitimate and that is credible. And for that reason, process is equally important to content. Content meaning the substance that you are going to negotiate about, what needs to be resolved, and what would be the end solution for the problems.
One of the major obstacles in Cameroon is distrust, lack of trust, absence of trust. How to build the trust? Because in the case of South Africa, you succeeded to build trust across the divide that existed. And the question now is how to build that kind of trust in the Republic of Cameroon in order to have all the parties, including the secession movement leaders, on the same table to discuss the solution, to discuss peace.
You know, Babila, I think it's a very simplistic process, how to build trust. You have to first of all look each other and in the eye as enemies. That is exactly what we did. When we started the process in South Africa, black and white were enemies. You can imagine how deep that animosity was, because for so long apartheid divided the people of South Africa. So when we started, we had to look each other in the eye and say to each other that we have to do this for the sake of the country and unifying the nation going forward. That is the first step. And then secondly, to listen to each other. So it's basic things that you have to do to make sure that you find this. Listen to each other, understand the problems. And then out of that, you start to develop slow by slow, through step by step, the process of trust building. And like I said earlier, I think first of all, you have to know each other. In other words, look each other in the eye and listen to each other. Secondly, to respect the other side, to respect the other person as an equal in the process. You might not like him, you might not agree with what he or she is saying, but you have to respect what they want as a solution. And then thirdly, you have to understand that person. You have to understand where he or she is coming from. I always say it's like putting yourself in the shoes of the person on the other side. Walk that way in your mind where that other person is coming from. And out of that, you can then start to build trust. And out of that, you can develop a positive relationship. I can tell you that in the South African case, from the stage where we started as enemies, and during the process of dialogue and negotiations, we eventually became friends. And you know what? That friendship even today lasts as a result of the trust that we developed in each other.
Now, can that trust enable such discussions by both parties, representatives of both parties within the national territory, so much suggesting that this can only take place out of the national territory on a neutral ground?
Well, again, from the South African experience, coming from that basis, I would say it's always better to have the negotiations in the country. There were also parties in the South African case, a party called the Pan-African Congress, PAC, that at the beginning wanted us to negotiate with them outside the country. We were willing to do so. I'm talking about the then apartheid government and this PAC. We were prepared to do so, and we in fact had our first meeting with them outside the country to make it possible for them to overcome the obstacle that they laid down. But after that, they were prepared to come back into the country. And then we started all together inside the country on an inclusive basis like I've explained. In the South African case, that was the way in which we followed the process to make it possible for all of us to come to a solution. So, my recommendation would be, but that is based on our experience, that is the best way to find the way forward. But if it needs, and in this case, one also has to learn to be tolerant of each other. If it's really making it difficult for an opposition group or a rebel group, whatever you call it, to start talks inside the country from the beginning, one has to accommodate that aspiration. The one thing that I learned from the South African case is that we had a lot of patience with each other. We became very tolerant of each other. And that is how we resolved our problems. Let me take one example to prove the point. In South Africa, we have many ethnicities, different ethnic groups. And the one way to resolve the different ethnic aspirations was, for instance, to say, let's accommodate all the languages in South Africa as official languages. So in South Africa, we have in our constitution guaranteed 11 official languages to accommodate all the ethnic groups in the country. Instead of having one language, we are saying let's have 11 languages, and it was the way to satisfy the aspirations of all our people.
All right, we're going to take a listen to some interviews, and we'll be right back to continue the discussion in some few minutes. Interviews of the week.
For 50 years now, it has been more of an assimilation scheme, well carved out by our French-speaking leaders to assimilate the Anglo-Saxon system. And that is why you see today everything speaks volume of itself. The multiple crisis that is already an arms struggle in the two English-speaking zones. We have Sadi now, we have Tonti now, we have Anglophone, and all those things emanate from our poor institutional organizations headed by individuals who are being used by former colonial master, the French.
We are very greedy. We think only about our individual selves and our tribes. We don't think of the common good, and that's where the shoe pinches. So when you see a lot of violence all over the whole place, Anglophones being angry, Bamilikes being angry, the Betis being angry, the Northerners being angry, there is no common thread of love that runs through all of us. And that is what is missing. Change and do what is right, what is just, and what is good.
Cameroonians are not emancipated. Cameroonians are not feeling at home. Today we have Cameroonians who are saying that let us go back to the 1961 constitution, which is federalism. Some others are saying it wouldn't solve the problem. It is because we are having a quack government. We are having a government who doesn't care about Cameroonians. That is why we'll tell you that the belang of our 50 years of unity is null and void. It has no use. I believe that if powers were handed to the right people, we won't have a problem.
I'm congratulating the teachers and the parents that have taken the bold step to let us teach their children here in Kumba due to the crisis. This morning, up to 10 children cannot leave Mato and get to Kumba. They cannot write equally in Mato due to the crisis. So they have missed the common entrance. We started on time, no doubt, but the children had to do some sacrifices because they left their homes so early as 4 a.m. to trek.
There are a lot of difficulties, when you leave your home displaced elsewhere, you don't carry all of your household material to where you are going because of the distance. And so the issue is, like I said, accommodation, where to sleep. They need mattresses, there is the problem of the children who came with their parents. Some don't have birth certificates. Some are in school, they need didactic material, schools, books, especially school fees, which they cannot afford. Even some adults, some have national identity cards that expired long ago, and in Gambetika we don't have an identification post, which we wish that the authorities in charge could provide for us. They cannot move because their ID cards are expired, and it's difficult for the ID cards to be established here because we don't have an identification post. So what do? For them to get a new ID card, you also need birth certificates. I know some of those adults too don't have birth certificates. And so the procedure is one that they need to go back, establish their court declaration before they can go to the council to establish birth certificates for them. The other issue is that of illness. When some of these children fall ill, it's difficult for the parents to afford money to take them to hospitals. And so you find that children are kept at home sick without means to take them to the hospital. Even if they get to the hospital, they will do their prescriptions. They may not have money to buy drugs. And so some of them who may have little money, they will prefer to go to the roadsides, buy medicine which is not of good quality. Some who have farms, those who have been given farms, they also need farm inputs. You have to produce maize, maybe you may need fertilizer. How do they afford the fertilizer? You may need machetes, cutlasses, and hoes. So they need people to support them, to provide these inputs for them to be able to do their farm work. For those who are here internally displaced, what we encourage them is for them to be able to live organized lives, should be peaceful, and to be able to collaborate with their hosts who are receiving them here.
Those were interviews of the week. Roelf Meyer, you were Minister of Constitutional Affairs, first under President Frederick de Klerk and later under President Nelson Mandela. Will you suggest constitutional amendments as possible solution to the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon? There are issues or debates on the form of the state, which is established in the constitution of the country. The government is holding on the decentralized system of government, while there are calls for a return to the initial federal system of government.
Let me say, I think for every contestation there is a solution. You know, and from what I could observe in the case of Cameroon, and what I heard from the people that I had discussions and interviews with, there are definitely solutions for the contestation that prevail in Cameroon. And let me use the example again of South Africa. In South Africa, we started off with debates on what kind of state we wanted. Would it be a unitary state, a pure unitary state, or would it be a federal state? And we had long debates because we had strong opposition within our midst on these different positions. And in the end, we had a solution because we were patient with each other. We were tolerant of each other. And we found agreement between us as opposing sides on a constitutional model that fit the needs of South Africa. And today, if you would ask South Africans whether we have a federal system, the answer is not clear. And if you would ask whether we have a unitary state, the answer would also not be clear. What we know is that we are one nation, and that is the important thing. And within that one nation, every individual is protected under the Constitution on an equal basis. Our Bill of Rights, contained in Chapter 2 of the Constitution, is a perfect set of rights for every individual, whether you're black or white. And I think that is the ideal. And that is why the South African Constitution is such an important part of our foundation. And now, 30 years later, South Africans are still adhering to that constitution. Sometimes maybe, like in the case of Cameroon, it's necessary to go back to the basics and ask yourself the question, is this constitutional framework fit for the aspirations of all the people? And if the answer is it doesn't work correctly, or it doesn't provide the answers for all the aspirations, maybe you need a reset button, so to speak, just to look again at what is the vision, what is it that you want for a future successful Cameroon. And let me anecdotally tell you one example. During our negotiations in South Africa, which lasted altogether about 6 years, we had moments where there were breakdowns in negotiations, breakdowns. At one stage, there was a complete breakdown in the negotiations. And the only way that we could find the answers was to go back jointly to the negotiating table and ask ourselves, what is the vision that we hold together for the country? And we jointly, black and white, came to a certain conclusion. What is the vision? What is it that we expect jointly from a future South Africa? And once we had clarity on that vision, we could find the answers on how to put it together in the constitutional framework of the country. So that is what I mean by saying you have to reset maybe and look at what is the Cameroonians want. What is the vision for the country? And be tolerant of each other, be patient with each other. Then the answers will come.
You were equally Minister of Defense in South Africa. Now, with your experience as Minister of Defense, what's your opinion about the use of military force in the northwest and southwest regions of the country? Soldiers deployed in their numbers in those two regions, tracking down and killing secessionist fighters, armed civilians, and displaying their mortal remains on the streets of Kumba, on the streets of Bamenda, like war trophies. Do you think this will create an enabling environment for genuine and inclusive dialogue to take place?
Well, let me, as a fundamental departure point, say, in principle, defense forces should never be used against their own people. Defense forces should never be used against the citizens of your own country. That is the principle I think that one should first embark on. And I find it therefore very difficult to understand why, in all cases, and I'm not talking here about Cameroon, there are other countries where the same is happening even today, that defense forces are being used against the people, the citizens of that country. And I think everything should be done to stop that, to stop the violence in the first instance, but also to stop the deployment of defense force units against the people of the country. And the answer to how to control the situation doesn't lie with defense. It doesn't lie with the use of military capability. The only answer is through dialogue. And the sad thing is, you know, the sooner you can end the violence, the sooner you can start the dialogue. By carrying on with the violence, it means there's action and reaction. As long as the military exercise action or military action, there will be reaction from the other side because people would feel they are justified to fight the military. And this is the very sad thing, as far as I can see it, that is also unfolding and happening in parts of Cameroon. And to my mind, and I speak here from a security perspective, I'm speaking as somebody who has lived through the South African Defence Force activities in the 1980s, where the Defence Force was also used under the Apartheid regime against the liberation movements, as totally wrong and unacceptable. That should never be. And I would hope that in the case of Cameroon, that would also be brought to an end and be stopped, so that dialogue can start. Because the moment the military stops, there should be no reason for rebels to take armed action or violent action. And the only way, therefore, to bring this to an end is to accept the need for talks and dialogue. And maybe what is necessary from all sides, from the side of the governing, from the side of the government of Cameroon, as well as from the opposition side and the rebels and so forth, is that there should be an effort to bring about a declaration of intent to stop violence and to replace it with a process that can find the real answers in a peaceful way, so that there's no need for further violence.
Now, in government's effort to stop the cessation activities in the northwest and southwest regions of the country, a lot of atrocities have been committed by the security and defense forces. Villages burnt down, people killed, several persons arrested and are currently being detained in incarceration or detention centers across the country, and many civil society and human rights defenders are now calling for their liberation on grounds that a peaceful negotiation, a genuine and inclusive dialogue that you're talking about cannot take place with those people in detention. Sisi Kwayub Tabe and the other leaders of the secession movement and the detainees of the Anglophone crisis in general. What do you think should be done about these atrocities that have been committed, because they have certainly left many people in grief, distrust of the military and the government officials, angry and disappointed with the government officials? What do you think should be done about these atrocities and the people who are in detention in the efforts to bring the parties together in a genuine and inclusive dialogue?
Well, I think first of all the violence must be stopped. It has to be brought to an end. And once that has been done, perpetrators have to be prosecuted. That is the normal process of law. Perpetrators who exercise the atrocities against civilians in many cases. And this, let me emphasize, goes across the board. All and every entity that is responsible for the violence. In the South African case, after we completed the process of negotiations and after we reached the settlement, there was, of course, the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, a process of transitional justice that was followed in order to ensure that the perpetrators are being brought to book, or they had to apply for amnesty under qualified circumstances according to the law that prevailed at the time. So I would say that this is all part of the process, but it can only start to unfold that process once the violence stops and be replaced by a peaceful process of talks and dialogue.
Do you think that setting free all the detainees of the Anglophone crisis can open the way to genuine dialogue and genuine and inclusive dialogue and negotiations?
Well, in the South African case, the process could not start before the release of President Mandela and others from prison, and the opening the borders for exiles, people that were across the border in other neighboring countries and elsewhere in the world, to return to South Africa. In other words, prisoners were released and exiles had the opportunity to return to South Africa. And only then the real process, the genuine process of inclusive dialogue could start. It's impossible to expect that you can have a process of genuine dialogue while people that are legitimately or have the legitimacy to be at the negotiating table are in detention or in prison. That's impossible to expect genuine dialogue under those circumstances. And like I say, in the South African case, for years there was a demand and the expectation that President Mandela would be released from prison, which didn't happen. And as long as that was the case, there was no genuine dialogue. Only once he was released, we could open up the process of talks and dialogue.
Now, many African countries, almost all African countries, and even the African Union and the Central African Regional Organization have been practically silent, have said or done little or nothing about the crisis in Cameroon, in the northwest and southwest regions. Your country, South Africa, is a giant, is a major power on the African continent. Do you think that the involvement of South Africa can bring some help in the efforts to restore peace and normalcy in those two regions?
Well, as we know, Africa is divided in regions, like you have mentioned yourself. South Africa naturally belongs to the Southern African Development Community, SADC, as it is called, which includes all the southern regional countries of the continent. Equally so, the East and the Central and the West have been divided in their own regions. And according to the practice that have been followed over the years, countries within these regions are very cautious in acting outside the boundaries of the respective regions. So it's within that constraint that I would say South Africa would be cautious in reaching out or overstretching its reach outside of the SADC region. But at the same time, South Africa is, as far as the Cameroonian situation is concerned, I think one can say a neutral player. We are sort of an objective player. It's in that capacity that I also personally went to Cameroon, not representing any specific interest. And I think that position that South Africa holds in this regard, one of neutrality and objectivity, can be a positive factor in trying to help and at least share ideas, share advice. I want to emphasize, in my personal view, one should not act or pretend to act as a mediator as far as Cameroon is concerned, but rather as an advisor and a solid supporter of a peace process that can bring peace to the country. In all the work that I'm involved with when it comes to conflict resolution, it's about bringing about peace and a peaceful solution to the conflict that prevails. And that is the main objective, therefore, is to bring all parties to the table. I don't have to choose a side in the case of Cameroon. My interest would be to ensure that all parties relevant to the conflict be brought to the table so that there can be proper dialogue and negotiations.
Thank you so much. That was the South African politician, Roelf Meyer, former Minister of Constitutional Affairs and Defense of South Africa, Chief Apartheid Negotiator, Conflict Resolution, Peace Processes and Negotiations Consultant. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for the interview and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us. That's it for today's edition of The Insight. Goodbye.